I need the video, Annalena. It's stopped. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you,
Oh,
Leslie.
yay! Well, you may not be able to see me, but you can hear me. Hi. Hi, Emily. Thank you. I'm Leslie Bolt. I am one of the business advisors for the Small Business Development Center at the NMJC down in Lee County. And I was fortunate enough to work with the New Mexico Small Business Development Center for almost the past 2 years with the webinar. So I'm glad to be back because it's been a long time. And I'm excited today because I get to introduce Diane Viegas. Did I say that correctly? Oh,
Viegas,
great.
yeah.
So I am really excited. She is joining us. She's a certified SCORE mentor. She holds an MBA from the University of New Mexico. She owns her own marketing consulting agency and has over 25 years of experience in the marketing industry. Wow. Diane will be presenting today's topic, Marketing is a Marathon, Not a Sprint. And I'm really excited to learn about this topic because I agree with her, and it looked like she had like some steps to show us. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to Diane. Please type any questions into the Q&A, and I'm sure she can pick them up either during the presentation or at the end. If you need any technical assistance, please chat it over to me. And Diane, I apologize for being a little tardy, but I'm sure you have great information.
First of all, thank you all for being here and thank you for having me. Yeah, we're going to dive right in. And of course, there's always a few little ground rules that you want to cover. And let me just make sure I have my stuff ready to go. So thanks for the introduction, Diane Viegas, marketing consultant. Just a couple notes. Make sure you mute your audio and have your ratio and fit window. And as she mentioned, we'll be doing the Q&A function, but I'll try to make sure that there's plenty of time towards the end so you can have your questions answered. Also, just a list of all the resources that are available for due to the COVID-19 pandemic. There's tons and tons of resources, so make sure that you know what they are so you can take advantage of them. And finally, the SBDC is fantastic as far as providing lots of training and counseling opportunities. So please note that there are these websites that you can go to get that information that you need. So let's kick it off and start talking about marketing being a marathon and not a sprint. Those of you that are familiar with running or training and those kinds of things, you know that a lot of work goes into a marathon. And those of you that may not be familiar, if somebody were to ask you, hey, do you want to go do a marathon next week? I'm going to guess that your answer is probably no. But if somebody were to say, hey, do you want to do a quick sprint? You might say yes. The reason is most people think they can do a sprint. And when they try to make that jump from sprint to marathon, more often than not, this is the result. We gas ourselves out, we just go, and then we collapse because we weren't properly prepared to take that on. So let's talk about how we can avoid that, okay? We already talked about me, but just a little bit more, because why not, right? I do have a broad spectrum of industry knowledge. I do have the degrees and such, and I have been working with other companies. And this is relevant in the sense that I've worked with companies that have multi-million-dollar budgets, and I've worked with companies that have, multi-hundred-dollar budgets. But the commonalities between the two is astoundingly the same. So before we go into how to build a good plan, let's talk about some of the more common mistakes that everybody makes. And straight up, I'll tell you right now, this is not about judgment. If you have done any of these things as a business owner, just know that you are in very good company because a lot of companies make these mistakes. So the goal is, let's go through these first. That way we can sort of put those aside and focus on the stuff that will help you. So as I mentioned, it's a very, very common story. A business owner is excited, they have a new product, they want to go to market. And one of the assumptions they make is that everybody is like them. Now, may or may not be true, but you have to be able to broaden your scope to really understand who your client is. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The next thing they think about, well, I have this wonderful product. Why wouldn't everybody want this product? Well, unless you have an unlimited budget, you really probably shouldn't have an unlimited target. So this is where targeting is really going to come into play and why it's so important. Not understanding your brand and sending mixed messages. So one thing about your brand, and you could spend a whole week talking about brand. Your brand is how people see you, and it's not necessarily how you see yourself. It's a piece of it, but it's also how other people outside of your circle see you. And we'll touch into that some more. This one is the one that I see a lot with all sides of businesses, is businesses will know, well, I got to do marketing. I got to do something. And they'll put it off and put it off and put it off because they're not quite sure what they want to do or what they should be doing for that matter. Well, something happens, or they have a grand opening or a big sale, and they rush out and then they just do something. Well, the problem with that is it leads to the other problems on the other side of the page. Is generally it's focusing on one tactic. There's some amazing media outlets here. And if someone happens to hit you at the right time, you might think that's the one answer for you. And while it might be part of your solution, generally there's not just one answer. So any good campaign, I can tell you right now, is going to be multi-tactical. The next thing that happens is, business owner buys X amount of dollars on whatever station of TV or radio or social or whatever it may be. They expect to see quick results. Marketing, much like training for a marathon, takes time. You have to build up, get the momentum, get stronger, get better results. So it's a process. And one thing that I would just advise all business owners to understand is really see that this is a long-term game. Because if you don't see your quick results right away, don't stop. That's a huge problem I see with business owners. They don't see those immediate results. They don't get that instant gratification as far as X amount of sales or whatever. And then they stop, they throw their money down, they're like, we're done with this. And then they cut their marketing budget and they're actually worse off than before. So if you are guilty, I don't want to use that word, if you've partaken of any of these behaviors, again, you're in good company. Lots of big and small businesses have done these things. So let's just take them to the side and let's start fresh and let's talk about what it's going to take to get you to this point. What we want is to have you feeling victorious, reaching your goal, strong, ready for the next one. So if you are familiar with running or any kind of fitness endeavor, you know that the first step is balancing your structure, but while also having flexibility. And that's the same thing with any good marketing plan. You want to have your long-term vision and a plan to get you there, but then you're also going to have to look at ways you can be flexible, or just know that that's going to come up at some point in time. So before we go into building your marketing plan, you have to build your brand. And again, we can talk about this forever, and I would love to, but we have time constraints. The things that you really want to think about is, what is your image? So your brand is your image. If you're a solopreneur, your brand is essentially you as a person versus what you stand for as a company if you're a bit bigger. One of the things you want to think about is how you are different than your competition. Now, I'm going to give you a real big caveat here is this isn't necessarily about how you're better than your competition. That's one thing you want to stay away from. Don't ever bring negativity into your space as far as saying, well, competitors do this, we do it better this way or whatever. You want to be very careful about not bashing anything. This isn't about bashing people to make you look good. This is about having the confidence in what you provide and that how you're different and why a consumer would care about that. And really it comes down to what benefits you provide. One of the things that we want to think about is, what is it that you're really selling? And straight up, I can tell you the hint is that it's not a service or product. When we get a little bit deeper, we'll talk about how people buy. And one of the things that they really look at is the emotional component of what their problem is and what the potential solution can be. For example, if you are let's say a plumber, are you selling solid plumbing services? Yes, you are. But what you're really selling is reassurance that their home is going to be safe and that there won't be water damage, and just that security of what they're doing is something bigger and better for their house, which means it's bigger and better for their family. So there's always that sort of emotional component. You really need to think through, how does your service provide that for your end customer, whether it's a consumer or another business? So that's your brand. You want to make sure you feel really solid in that before you start your plan. Now, before we go into the actual plan itself, there's one more thing we want to talk about. What is your core message? I'm sure you all have heard tons of times about what your why is. Why are you doing this? And generally, it's not just, oh, so I can make a buck. It's because you have something that's going to better the community or better your environment or whatever it may be. So figure out what your why is. What is it you're trying to accomplish? And really the big note here is, why should your consumer care? That's the big thing. When we talk about marketing as a whole, I want you to sort of shift the paradigm a little bit. A lot of times people think marketing equals sales. Well, typically marketing supports sales. Marketing is the education of what the service or product is going to do for somebody. So then the sales team can go and close that sale, and then it's this lovely symbiotic relationship. So really, why should your consumer care? What is it? Basically, what is in it for them? That's what you want to kind of have at the top of your mind when you're putting your core messaging together. And really it comes down to, what is it that they need? Okay, so we're going to talk deeper about that, but I highlighted that on purpose because it comes down to, what is the emotional need there? Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit more into the next slide. But one thing I want you to keep in mind is, when you have your core message, that is the core of who you are. You're going to have multiple tactics that you talk to, or I'm sorry, multiple targets that you talk to. And you're going to want to change up that core message a little bit to fit that individual target, because you want to talk to them like you're talking to them one-on-one. An example might be, let's say you own a driving school. So I have teenagers in my house. So that's a very top of mind situation for me. The way a good driving school is going to market to me, they're going to be talking about the safety. They're going to be talking about reliability of the instructors and their program. They're going to be talking to me about potentially cost savings on insurance side, all those important parent type things. Whereas when they're marketing to my kids, they're probably going to talk more about, oh, it's a comfortable environment. It's safe here. We teach you one-on-one. We'll make you feel, confident in your driving abilities. So that's just a real quick example of how the core message is going to stay the same, that you would provide this type of service for this particular reason. And here's how we're going to talk differently to our different targets about that. And we'll do another example later on, but I just want to kind of just have that in your head a little bit. All right. If you have taken Psych 101, you're probably familiar with Maslow. If you have not, that's okay. We're going to go ahead and go over that real quick. And there's a reason why we're doing this. As I mentioned earlier, we talk about satisfying the emotional needs of our clients, of our prospects, of our customers, of the people that we ultimately want to do business with. Maslow had this whole hierarchy of human needs. Every human has these base needs. And if you start at the bottom here, these are the most important needs. So these are going to be your physiological needs, like air, food, water, basic survival needs that we all have. Once these needs down here are met, then we graduate to the next level, where our focus then turns to safety needs. These are going to be things like personal security, employment, resources, health, property, those types of things. If we feel solid in these needs, then our needs go up to this next level, and so on and so on. Now, the reason why this is so important, especially now during this time period, for the most part, pre-COVID, a lot of people were probably in these top 3 tiers where they were focusing on these right here. Once COVID hit and our world took a dramatic shift, a lot of our needs became down here towards these bottom 2. And understanding how the needs of your client or your target or your consumer or your prospect, whatever you want to call it, understanding what their needs are is going to be vital in how you choose to talk to them or how you should relate to them. The other thing that you want to consider is what type of product you offer or service, and where does that fit in this category. If you are a provider of personal security systems for people's homes, you're going to be hitting on this level right here, versus for someone who maybe is a jeweler that might be focusing on some of these top areas here. And depending on who you're targeting, you may talk to a potential fiance very differently than you're going to talk to someone who wants to celebrate an achievement with a piece of jewelry. So things to keep in mind on how the psychology is going to factor into what you're doing. So a little touch of Psych 101 for you. So once we get into the plan, one of the things that we want to look at, of course, is your goal. And we all know about SMART goals, about being, specific and measurable, attainable, all those types of things. This is incredibly important when it comes to your marketing plan. So always think SMART when it comes to your goals. And we'll get into detail and we'll give some examples of what that's going to look like. Your plan is your framework. There's that whole joke about, what happens when you make plans? Well, they implode. So that's why I want to make sure up front, we're looking at plans as your framework, not as anything that is set in stone, because we all know things can change in a heartbeat. So your plan is your framework. And then these things down here, the keys right here are going to be consistency, clarity, and being concise. And how that factors in is in this lovely blue grid that I love to share with folks. And if you had to basically draw a marketing plan, this is what it would look like. So the first things you want to do is figure out your brand and your key messaging points. So that's it. So the orange part up here is your do not pass go until you do this type of thing. These blue boxes represent the components of the plan. These boxes down here, the other orange ones, represent your foundation. And again, this is where you're going to focus on being clear, concise, and consistent. And these goals, these keys here, apply to every one of these individual boxes. So that's why they're down here, because this really is one of the foundational elements of what you want to do. So why does a plan matter? When you have a plan, there's that whole thing of like when you plan or you don't, when you fail to plan, you plan to fail. That whole, I'm sure y'all are with me on that. Bottom line is plans are good things to have. In recent studies, they have looked at marketers that have an actual written out strategy were 2 times as likely to say their efforts were effective than those that did not have a plan. So if you're going to put your money and your time and whatever resources you have into your marketing plan or into your marketing for your business, you want to make sure it's effective. That's what this whole thing is all about. Also keep in mind, 5% of the lowest tier marketers that have as rated on how effective they were, only 5% of these people had a written out strategy. So basically the people that did the worst, only 5% of them had an actual marketing strategy written out. So hopefully those 2 will stick with you as far as why this matters and why it's so important. So let's go back to our framework here. One thing I want is to have this image burned in your head. So you're going to see this a lot during this presentation. And the reason why, it's just a real quick visual of the things that you're going to need to get your plan put together. So the 3 C's again, to recap, are to be clear with your brand, your message, and your targets. You want to be concise with your goals, the targets that are targeted, and make sure that your message is easily understood. When we talk about messaging, we do a little side note tangent here. When you talk about messaging, and I should have put this on some of the more common mistakes, is a lot of times businesses are so excited about what they have to offer and they're so proud of what they can do, which you should be. When they want to tell their clients about it or their prospects, they want to put 1,000 words into a 6-word space. And the problem with that is the attention span isn't there. So one of the things I recommend for a lot of businesses is when you're putting together your key marketing messages, focus on concise, and if you can, do the billboard test. And the billboard test is when you go down the freeway, 25 Paseo, wherever it may be, make a mental note of the billboards. I'm going to guess if there's a lot of wording on the billboards, your mind automatically bypasses it, turns off, and just moves on. You don't even know what you saw. You just know it was too much to intake at that moment when you're going 65 down the freeway. If it has 6 words or less and a good image to accompany it, then you're more than likely going to remember that. So when you start putting your key messaging together, strive for that 6-word limit. Now, if you go over a word or 2, not a big deal, but it's a really great exercise in using the right words to convey what you want to and getting your point across in a very quick method. So little homework thing to try. And then be consistent. So consistency is so important in When you establish your brand, keep that going. It takes people time to really recognize and understand what you're trying to say and to put the pieces together. In general, if you were to Google how many times somebody has to see a marketing piece for it to actually register in their head, it's going to be anywhere from 7 to 11 times. And this also goes back to get out of your own head as a business owner. As a business owner, you have probably seen that marketing copy for the last 6 months, and you're probably on your 1,000th time looking at whatever. Well, that's not how many times your consumer has seen it. So while you may feel like you've seen it too many times and you're bored of it, you might just be barely starting to build a momentum in your market. So consistency is key. And same thing with the activity itself. You have to keep activity going to eventually start to see some of the results. One of the things I advise my clients to do is when you start a new tactic, of course you want to watch it, and it varies per tactic, but you want to have it in the market for at least 3 months or so you can see how it's moving and what it's doing. If you do something just once or for only a month time period, you're probably not going to see the action that you want to see from it. So again, going back to the mistakes to avoid, write it out, sit it through, tweak some copy if you need to, if you're not getting the response, or tweak some imagery, but you want to keep the tactic in the market. So let's talk about finding the right fuel. Anytime you're training, whether it's for a marathon or any type of thing, you want to make sure that you're taking in the right fuel. Using our marathon analogy, you're not going to be snacking on, Twinkies and ding dongs thinking that you're going to hit optimal performance. Well, same thing with your marketing. You want to make sure that what you're putting into your plan is solid and efficient, and it's going to give you the most results. So what does that look like? You want to look at your targets and your tactics. Now let's talk about our targets first, because that's going to drive what our tactics are going to be. Again, not everybody is your prospect, and that's perfectly fine. If you don't have an unlimited budget, you don't have unlimited targets, and that's great. So you really want to think about who are you really selling to and who will get the most benefit for what you have to offer. Some things that you want to look at are going to be the core demographics. You're going to want to look at, all right, so what's the average age? What are their interests? Where do these people typically live, et cetera? What is their socioeconomic status? How much money do they generally make? What kind of hobbies do they have? One really common piece of advice that actually works pretty well is to create a persona. So if you're going to be doing, I'm just going to pick something off the top of my head. Let's say you're selling pizza. Let's say you're a pizza restaurant. Okay. So are you a high-end pizza restaurant, or are you kind of a family-friendly pizza restaurant? If you're family-friendly, okay, so what is your price range? Are you going to be by schools? Are you going to appeal towards, students versus families, or different times during different days? What's your price range? Like what zip code are you in? Like those kinds of things. Are you focusing on a specialty kind of pizza that, maybe comes back from Rome that you want to hit, certain parts of town that have that particular, whatever. All these kinds of things will come into play as you start thinking about who is the best person to hit. And once you sort of put all those people into a person, then you can say, okay, well, people that are like this is what I'm looking for. This is who I want to target. That'll get you where you want to be. Once you have your target, that'll help you figure out your tactics. So when it comes down to your tactics are the how. Your target is the who, and then your tactic is going to be the how. One of my favorite quotes about strategy and tactics is, strategy without the tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. Interesting, isn't it? So when we start talking about the tactics, this is where you take your persona, or what you've identified as your target market, and you think, okay, where does this person hang out? Where do they get their media? Where do they get their information? Where does it make sense for me to put my dollars and have my business's name so I can make sure that they are seeing me? There's a couple different routes you can take. The traditional path is going to be things like billboard, radio, TV, print, the tactics that have been out for a long period of time. Then you also have this whole world of digital tactics. And these are going to be things like email campaigns, SEO, SEM, social media, a whole different world, and they both have their benefits. On the traditional space, if you have a fairly large target, so let's say you're that plumber. being on TV and maybe having a billboard might be a good combination for you if you have the budget to allow it, because you're hitting pretty much all homeowners in whatever parts of town you want to be in or across the state or whatever. The benefit of traditional tactics is you hit a lot of people. The downside is it can be really expensive depending on what you're looking at doing. Your other option on the digital side, what's amazing about digital is that you can really, micro target who you want to hit. You can say, I want to hit women between the age of 25 and 35, and I want them to be in this part of town, and I want them to have the interests of skincare and fashion. You can get that minute and then some on the digital side, whereas on the traditional side, it's really not as easy to target. But again, you have a much broader spectrum, and then your message is out there for much longer on the digital side. I'm sorry, on the traditional side. Whereas on the digital side, you can change up your messaging daily if you wanted to, or hourly if you wanted to. So any good plan that you have is going to have a mix of things depending on what your budget is, but there's definitely places for both of these. When we talk about social media, it is definitely probably the lowest cost or one of the lowest costs for any business to go into marketing. Now, if I have a micro business or a business that's new, one of the things I will suggest to them is, start with the lower cost things that you can afford and then grow from there. Email is definitely one that will, is a factor. We can talk about that later. But social media. Social media is a great platform for entry into the market because it does have the ability to micro target, and you can switch it around as you need to. I'm not saying stop the process. I'm saying if you're seeing that one particular ad isn't working, you can always go in and tweak that. But the long-term goal is to always have something in market or to continue that momentum to see the eventual needs. A couple of things you want to keep in mind, though, is they're social platforms. People don't go there to get sold to. They go there to be social with other people like them. So you really want to make sure that you build the personality of your channel or platform or whatever it is that you're using and create that community, be a part of that community, engage with them as another community member. And as I'm sure you all know, there are a ton of different platforms that you can be a part of. It's very common for people to say, okay, well, I know I need to do social media, but there's just so much of it. I don't even know where to start. Perfectly fine. Research which platform makes the most sense for your audience. Different platforms have different demographics on them. So you want to look at which one is most in alignment with what your target is. Oftentimes, currently in the current state, Facebook is an easy place to start because it has the broadest range of ages. And so depending on what your product is, that might be a good place to start. And what I recommend is start with one, get really comfortable with it, really nail it down, get your process going, and then incorporate another one. And when you're comfortable with that one and what it's doing, incorporate another one. So that way it doesn't seem like a big behemoth of social media that you're working on, but you're incorporating little chunks at a time. Social media is another topic that you could spend an entire week talking about. But if you break it down into little pieces, it's a lot more palatable, and it's an ever-changing platform. So there's a lot that you can learn there as far as different things you can do, including learning what your clients and prospects are saying, not only about your product, but competitive products as well. And when you do that kind of activity, it's called social listening. So social listening is a great way to get customer feedback. As I'm sure you may have noticed by now, a lot of companies will actually have, especially Twitter accounts just to engage with customers in a way that's quicker than if they were to email them or call them or whatever. So things to keep in mind with that. And this little graph just shows exactly how many people are using social. And this was 3 years ago. So I'm guessing these numbers are significantly more by now. So back then, 90%, over 90% of millennials were on social. And even when you look at the boomer population, if you have a product that appeals to an older audience, I'm guessing by now you're probably over 50% of boomers are on social. So it's a great way to reach people for a low cost entry point that can also help you target very, very minutely. So it's a great way to go. All right, so let's go back to our framework here. So this is again what we're looking at. We've talked about targets and tactics. We did skip a little bit because we have some time considerations, but I wanted to spend a couple little minutes talking about these here. You want to make sure that you define your goals before you go too far into anything. And when it comes to goal setting, again, we talked about doing SMART goals. One thing I want to make sure that you walk away with is whenever I ask a business owner, what's your goal? I can almost guarantee they're going to say make more money. And that's great. We all want that because why else would you be in business, right? There's always a component of that. But the question I ask them is how? Are you going to get more clients? Are you going to retain clients? Are you going to upsell your current clients? Are you increasing, your span of products that you offer and increasing revenue through there? So that's where I'm talking about getting into the specifics of exactly how you're going to do this, because that's going to drive how you use your tactics. The KPI component, KPI is just your key performance indicators or what you're measuring. So this is what you want to look at in conjunction with your goals. So if you say, I want to increase revenue by 10% by going to my existing clients and trying to upsell with the new product launch that I'm going to be having in June. Okay, that's defining your goal. You're going to existing customers. Your KPI is the 10%, and then your target is going to be the existing customers. So that's really what you're looking at with these things right here. When we move into timing is all about leveraging other elements that are out in the market that you can use to your benefit, as well as looking at what's going on internally in your company to make sure that you can accommodate what you're trying to achieve. Because at the end of the day, you want to go back to that goal. What is it you're trying to accomplish? So some ideas around timing might be leveraging seasonal events. So for example, we're right before Mother's Day. If you have a product that relates to women of mother age, which could be anything from 18 on up, you would probably leverage using Mother's Day as a reason for people to come and use your product or buy your product or service. You also need to look at what your internal resources are. And I think one of the biggest issues that we can all understand, or at least sort of see around us right now, is employment. If you don't have the employee resources, you're going to have to really think through, okay, what is the time going to look like for you? When can you get those? Do you need to fill manufacturing jobs? Do you need to fill frontline jobs, server jobs, those types of things? But also, if you're looking at doing something and it has a timing element, see what community partnerships there are for you. Are there other organizations that would make sense for you? For example, if you are in senior home care, if you're doing that, there's Alzheimer's Awareness Month. Can you partner with other organizations that promote those types of services for seniors, and you could collectively do something to promote all your businesses and essentially leverage each other's credibility and funds to get a bigger response than you might typically on your own. Look at, are there any kind of educational opportunities? If you're in a trade situation and you have a big trade show coming up, can you present seminars? Can you share case studies? What can you do to keep your name out there and share information with the people that may be of need of your service? And then also, are there any sort of press opportunities? There's always something in the news about what's going on, and then there's businesses that come in and say, okay, we can help support that, or we can be a partner here, and those types of things. So it's always about being aware of what's going on in your community and how you can leverage that or become a part of it to help increase the exposure and awareness of your business. So these are just some of the things that you can do around the timing component. All right, so here we are. We've talked about goals, KPI, your targets and your tactics and your timing, which is the bulk of your plan here. There's two things here that are typically overlooked, and they're just as important as the other two, and that's going to be your internal marketing and your retention. When we talk about internal marketing, this is working with your internal sales team to make sure they understand from the very ground floor what's going on. A lot of times you'll get a lot of great information from your sales team about what customers want to see. What kind of incentives can you do with other departments? Because somebody is working in the accounting department doesn't mean they don't affect your sales. If a consumer has an issue with their bill, that might affect how they look at you overall as a company. So it's kind of getting everybody in sync with what the company is ultimately trying to do, what that end goal is. So let's say your goal was to increase revenue by reducing retention, or by increasing retention of your current clients. Well, that's going to probably include your customer service department, probably your accounting department. If you have a technical team, all these people have a piece of that. If it's purely that you're looking at wanting to increase clients, can you create incentives for your technicians to upsell, or your accounting team to maybe have your accounting team include promotional materials and the bills. There's all kinds of things you can do to get all the teams on board with what the goals are. And one of the ways that you really sort of get that up and going is to get the buy-in with them and share the information of, this is our goal, here's how we're going to do it, and here's how you can be a part of that goal. So really kind of keeping transparency within the company as far as what you want to do and how they can help hit that target. If you don't have a big team, a lot of times companies will have 1, 2, 3, 4 people. Create brand ambassadors, your circle of other business owners, your circle of friends, your circle of influencers around you. Keep them up to date with what's going on in your business and have them be spokespeople for your business. Or use loyal customers, to help you be that, voice for your business through testimonials and things of that nature. So there's a lot of things you can do internally without spending a lot of money to help you hit your targets. When you look at retention is incredibly important. And quite frankly, it's I think one of the most forgotten areas. And it's really kind of sad when you look at how much money it costs to get a new client compared to just keeping one. And here's one of the stats, and I have little footnotes at the end of where you'll be able to find more information on this, is acquiring a new customer can cost you anywhere from 5 to 25 times more than retaining a current one. And if you are on a micro budget, or even if you're just very conscientious of your funds, you want to really take a moment or two to think this through. Increasing your retention, of course, can increase your profits, and here's a stat for that as well. But I mean, if you really just sort of think through, what does it take to have better retention? Well, first of all, you want to track your retention, and that would be one of the things as part of your KPI, your key performance indicators. You're going to measure that. But really, it's very simple. It's a matter of things like thank yous. Thank yous are probably one of the most underrated things that are out there. The impact of that. It could be loyalty rewards. It could be something like, if you're going to launch a new product or a new service, giving your loyal base of customers first crack at it, or allowing them to be beta testers, or those types of things. So there's a lot of things that you can do that are relatively expensive, if not free, to work on the retention side of things. And the bonus is, the more your customers love you, the more they're willing to talk about you and give you good Google ratings and those types of things. It's actually doing a lot. So things to keep in mind. All right. So I've been doing a ton of talking about theoretical things. What does it look like when you actually put this together? So let's walk through that real quick, and I'll show you. So here's a fictitious company. Let's calling it the camera company. Their brand, what their why is, what they really want to do is they focus on intuitive cameras for innovative photographers. Cool. All right. So that's who they're really trying to service. Their key message is creatively capture the moments that last a lifetime. Now, what's different about this one is intuitive and innovative and creatively. So those 3 words alone already give you a sense of, all right, these are a certain kind of photographers. So when I talked about being concise, that's why these things are so important, because you really have to think through, how do you nail down, the brand or the key message succinctly, so that when you say them to somebody, or somebody sees your message, they understand what you're looking for. This probably isn't somebody who's just doing it for the weekend, adventure. This is somebody who has invested time, and somebody who has probably a certain perception of how they do their work and see it as artistry rather than just taking a photo, right? So let's walk through the individual boxes. Our goal is to increase operating cash flow by 7% year over year. All right, so now we know what we're looking at. We're looking at specifically at cash flow. How are we going to do this? Our key performance indicators are going to be 2. They're going to increase year over year customers by 20%. Okay, so we're going to bring more people in the door. We're using year over year as our indicator. So that's our measuring stick by 20%. So that's our how much. And we're also going to increase camera sales by 10%. So when you look at your KPI, these are things that we can very clearly measure with our sales activity and how our financials are coming together. So this is something we can definitely do. So we know what the goal is. And these 2 things are things that you could share with all the departments in your company, or all team members of your company, so they understand what the goals are. So who's our target? Our target, we know based off of our current client base. So let's just say we've been in business for 3 years, and we've already seen a pattern that our target, or our audience base, leans more female. They tend to be New Mexico based. 65% of them are professional photographers, and 82% of them are within the age range of 35 to 55. This gives us a fairly clear picture of who we're looking for. Now, we could probably drill down and get even more information like, what types of hobby do these people like, those types of things. If you're stumped on getting this information and you've already been in business, you have the benefit of, you can do that. Go back and look at who your existing client base is and see what the commonalities are. If you are brand new to the situation, this might be something where, maybe you start doing some test marketing and some surveying of your friends and your known folks, and, start putting some of that together. You might want to do some tests on social media to see who's responding to your ad. So there's a way to do things either way. But if you're in business, you should be able to get this information hopefully fairly easily. So now that we have our target, we want to look at our tactics. Now our tactics are going to be driven by our budget, and we don't have a huge budget at the camera company because we've only been in business for 3 years and we're still sort of putting together our foundations. We're going to focus on social media. Okay, social media is a very visually driven platform. So that makes a lot of sense for us. We want to do something like that, maybe showcase some amazing shots that have been done with our cameras before. We're also going to do email. Again, email is incredibly cheap. All you really need is people's email addresses and a email software program similar to like MailChimp or Constant Contact or those kinds of mail programs. And of course, you want to make sure that your key messaging and everything is in line, and we can talk about email for another week if you wanted to. But then we're also going to do some print because we know that these are very visual people and they probably still subscribe to sort of, maybe some photography magazines or things of that nature. So we're going to include that in our buy. Internally, we're going to do a social incentive. So we're going to ask our internal employees to share information about our company and our new camera launch. And we're going to incentivize them that whoever's the most creative about it can get, a free camera of their own. Or we could even give them each a camera and have them take photos with said camera and use those on social. So there's all kinds of really cool creative things you can do for incentives. We're also going to include a sales incentive. So for our sales team, if we have one, we're going to go ahead and give them an incentive for the person that sells the most cameras in the next month or whatever it is. On the retention side, we're going to offer discounts to our loyal base of customers. Maybe the customers that have been with us from the very beginning, we're going to give them a 20% discount to try our new camera. When we open up our store again, maybe we offer them, special hours for VIP clients where they can come in an hour before the store opens to just look at everything before everybody else gets there. And then we may also have a social incentive to incentivize them to share their photos and just add a hashtag with our company of taken by such and such camera, whatever. So there's our general plan. The one thing that we haven't added yet is timing. So what is timing going to look like for us? So this is just a basic Excel spreadsheet. And all this really looks at is, all right, so if I have a calendar, what are the seasonal themes that we talked about? We talked about leveraging community seasonal elements. What's going on that I can potentially leverage? What's going on within the community and the company that's going to be important? So let's say we have a grand reopening in June of our shop. Okay, so that's there. You would just lay in who your target is, and we've identified who that is. What are the key messages? So this was put together during a little bit more of the height of the pandemic. So one of the things that we were going to focus on was going to be safety and new hours. And then these are the tactics. Facebook and Instagram, those are probably the two platforms that are going to work best for us. So we want to go ahead and lay those in. Our secondary tactic is going to be Constant Contact or any kind of email program. I just happened to put this one in there. And then our third tactic is going to be things that are going to support these two. So maybe we're going to get some now open signs in May for our June launch. We're probably also going to put stuff in the local paper because we have a great community that supports local businesses, those types of things. And then we have our incentives laid out here, and as well as retention. So that's really all this is. It's just a long-term view of what we're going to be doing. The reason why we do it for this amount of period, I always recommend 6 to 12 months. And the reason for that is you can leverage timing, not only from what's going to be going on, but let's say that this is your plan and you're going to be working on your email campaigns. In theory, you could set up your email campaigns for the next 3 months in an afternoon, or at least get the creative for it. Or let's say you're going to hire a photographer of your new store because you know you have all these promotional elements coming up. So when you do that, you can say, all right, cool. So let's go ahead and hire a photographer. We want to do something in November around Thanksgiving and Christmas. So let's make sure we get some Christmas shots now. That way we can get the efficiency of costs and time. So we don't have to scramble and start all over again during this time of the year. So it's just really kind of your big high level plan of how you want to do that. So that's essentially how that would come together. So what happens when things go sideways? And we all know that things can happen very easily with that. Well, you pause, you pivot, but you persevere. Anything can happen, whether it's operational changes, budgetary adjustments, shifts in the environment, which is essentially kind of what we're going through. And just as a quick example, when we talk about Maslow's needs, it's going to change how your consumer behavior if it's a big enough change. So we're going to go a little quickly through these because there's a time situation. I want to make sure you guys have time for questions. But just for example, in August a year ago, 75% of consumers were demonstrating new shopping behaviors than they had pre-pandemic. So how you look at your targets and your tactics is going to have to change to match what they're going to be doing. And I think this one down here is also important, is more than 70% plan to permanently adopt pandemic-friendly behaviors. Even as we start to leave an official pandemic, hopefully, the behaviors are going to continue. So those are things you want to keep in mind. Same thing is happening on the advertiser side. We're seeing the drop in traditional media, the drop in traditional and increase in digital. Where people are spending their money, where companies are spending their money is shifting based on where consumers are going to be. So take the time to think about that thing. But the base of it stays the same. So the foundations are the same of understanding the needs of your target, connecting with them wherever they are, and communicating with them in an authentic way. And that again goes back to your messaging and being concise and true to your brand and who you are. So currently we're looking at a work from home mentality, tighter budgets and reduced spending, and a desire for normalcy. So as you put together your campaigns and your messaging, things that you want to think about and how it's going to affect, your potential clients. So going back to Maslow's needs, last year we were probably down here. We're gradually going back up here again, but you never know when this is going to happen. So it's almost like your messaging needs to hint at these elements, but to have people aspire back to these levels due to that desire for normalcy. And again, COVID was huge globally. We have a very different mindset as far as people being concerned about their health. So you don't want to ignore that. You want to be able to address that. And just overall concern from the community and the health of the community. So lots of things to keep in mind. And when it comes to consumer loyalty, I think we had such a huge example of this during the pandemic time period. It became about value. It became about convenience and about availability. So when you think about your company, you want to think about how do you measure up in each of these categories. And I'll give you a quick example of pivoting. And, when we talk about Black Friday, we all had pre-pandemic, the vision of people stomping down doors to get to, the latest, toy craze. When it first hit, before the pandemic in 2019, it became Gray Thursday, where suddenly the shopping came earlier. It was like limited time offers, in-store only specials. Well, pandemic hits. What happens? Before pandemic. Actually, it was pandemic. Sorry. It was okay. Now nobody's working on Thursdays because everything was closed down. Instead of just doing one little sale, they started doing multiple sales because everything was online now, and curbside delivery. In 2021, it became a hybrid of the two, but the problem was there was now supplier issues. So early shopping was encouraged, and it was online and in person. So whether you're a big shopper or not, just by looking at this, you can see how the environment shifted the consumer impact of how they shop and what they do. And as business owners, you need to be constantly aware of what's going on so you know how to address things that are going to meet the needs of your clients. So once you have your plan in place, there's always a need for fine tuning to achieve maximum results. And that just basically means review your results, regularly. Look at your goals, make sure that you're still tracking to that, or if you need to adjust your goal, that based off of your information that you're getting back from your campaigns, and keep your KPIs and your tactics and your messaging flexible, because nothing is going to be set in stone in marketing or in business for that matter. Continually refine on what you're working on, and if it's not working well, then adjust. But the key message here is always resume your marketing efforts and just do not stop. Just keep going, even if your budgets change. There's a way to still do things They're incredibly, economically friendly or free, but keep going. So the final recommendations are to, create and follow your plan, be prepared and be flexible, review your progress regularly, fine-tune your progress, and continue moving forward. Your key takeaways are going to be to understand the needs of your target. If you can, repurpose your content. Unfortunately, we didn't go too far deep into that, but if you have something that works well on one platform, you can modify to use it for other platforms, so you don't have to constantly be recreating the wheel. Communicate an authentic way of who you are and what your company stands for. And appreciation and recognition matter, especially of your clients. Make sure you're giving them the appreciation they need and keep them as a loyal customer. And finally, if you need more information, you can always go to the NMA SBDC for tons and tons of information, and always good stuff there. So if there's any questions, I know I left a whole hearty 7 minutes for questions, but if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to answer anything.
Awesome. Hi, Diane. It's nice meeting you. I'm so excited that you're here presenting, and it is open now for questions. But I have some questions. You were saying at the beginning that people get really excited when they first open their business, and so you have the big grand opening celebrations, and you may have the friends and families coming in, and they swarm in, and you think everything's going great, but after that, it may have a lull and they think, I don't have that. So do you have some suggestions on really drilling down and figuring out how much you should spend for your marketing? Because you said don't give up, but what if you feel like it's tied to sales, or you're worried about how it's going?
Fantastic question. And thank you so much for bringing up the budget element. If you were to Google how much of my money should I spend on marketing, you're going to see a very wide range of anywhere from 5 to 10% of what you want your end cash flow to be.
Mm-hmm.
What I would suggest, especially for a small or micro business, is start with what you're comfortable with, but always have something. I mean, even if it's only 5% of your total budget, you want that there, and you want to have it consistently every month. When you talk about the big grand opening, absolutely, a lot of people will spend a big chunk of money on that, and that's fine, but you want to maintain that consistency to keep the momentum going. So I cannot give you a specific hard number. It's going to be very dependent on what the business owner is comfortable with, but as long as there's some activity there, and even if you have, again, a micro budget, even if it's just an email campaign, you're just using your time versus actual money, but just keeping something out there.
Okay, awesome. We have a question that came in, so let's see what we've got. Fran, great presentation, Diane. I was wondering if you can please share the slides, as this is great info we can share with our clients.
Yeah, I believe the
Yes.
DC folks have a a PDF version of the presentation, and I'm more than fine with that being shared.
Great. I will let Adrienne know. I believe she shares the information, and then they put it on demand and on YouTube afterwards. So that's great. Also, could you go back to the one slide with the that you had showed a couple times about the marketing strategy, just to give us a quick overview of that again?
Of the blocks?
Yes.
Yeah, these blocks are my heart and soul and make me happy. Okay. So really, what we covered in this last hour, a lot of people take years to sort of work on and learn, but really this is what it comes down to is, if you can do these things, these are the things I want to really just stick with you, is have those goals right up front. Have them know what it is that you want to do and be very specific about it, because there are so many different things you can do with your marketing. I mean, it could be something like increasing web traffic 25%, or it could be something like, retaining more customers. It's just such a wide field. And when you have the focus on what you want to change, then that really is a game changer, because you're just laser focused on that. And measure. The spreadsheet that I showed, it was very simplistic, but you can also add to that is, what your goals are by month below that, and did you actually hit those, or what your actual numbers were from the previous year if you're doing year-over-year comparison. So there's a lot you can do around that too. And it's in bigger companies, finance and marketing tend to be a little oil and water because, finance wants to keep money, marketing wants to spend it. Really, finance and marketing should be partnering together on, sharing the information as far as how the numbers are moving in relation to the marketing activity and setting goals that make sense for both departments. So I would say partner with your finance team to get those nice and solid. And really, most people think of marketing as, this part right here is the targets and tactics. And absolutely, that's the heart and soul of it. But again, it goes down to fine tuning what it is you're trying to do based off of the goals here. So all of these essentially just grow upon each other. And again, it's that momentum. You want to keep moving these forward. But then these guys right here, I've worked with companies that were able to put resources on these two elements right here and had phenomenal responses. Because once you have your whole team on board with what you're trying to do, it really elevates your game because everybody is, paddling forward and trying to get you. Everybody's essentially cheering you on to the finish line versus not understanding what's going on and sometimes inadvertently sabotaging the efforts, so very important there.
Thank you, Diane, for a great presentation today. And also, I want to go to Rome and do a pizza tour throughout the countryside, like you had said. So I'm going to remember that. But we want to thank you and SCORE for being such a good resource partner for Small Business Development Center. And we appreciate your time today. I'm going to dismiss all the attendees today, and I appreciate you hanging around. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you say you needed me to stay on or no?